Today we're going to talk about something that's not very pleasant, but it needs to be talked about. Why? Because it's in the scriptures. You see, the Apostle Paul, it started out in before that, it started out talking about who Jesus is. And then in verse number 21 of chapter 1 of Colossians, it's who we were. And then comes Jesus coming and he dying on the cross, and how we are now holy and blameless. And then in verse number 23, it's how to walk in faith, believing. Now, verse number 24, actually, the Apostle Paul ends verse number 23 by saying this: I am a minister. I'm a minister of what I've just taught you. In other words, I'm here to deliver this message to you. And then verse number 24 says this: Now I rejoice in my suffering for your sake. Now you can read that and you can say, that is the strangest thing I have ever read. You rejoice. Now this word rejoice is the Greek word charos, and it means to have joy. It means to have great contentment. It means to have this joy that comes by knowing that you've done a great job. Wow. Here's Paul. And he says, I'm a minister of what I've just told you. But then he turns right around and he says, and I rejoice in the sufferings. I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake. Paul is telling us here that the things that I brought to you, they have caused me to suffer. Now, where is Paul writing this from? Paul is writing this letter from the Roman prison. Now, it's not as severe of a prison as he's going to experience later on. But you remember, Paul has suffered a lot. He's been beaten. He's been stoned. He's been shipwrecked. All of these things happened to Paul because of one thing. He is preaching the gospel. You see, the gospel preached will always bring suffering. Do you understand that? You might be thinking, well, in my church, there's not any suffering, and we're preaching the gospel. Yeah, but if you would go back into the history of your church, you'll find out that there was a person who stood up when there was no church. And that person was ridiculed, that person was laughed at, that person was probably even hated, even here in the United States, because of what they were doing, preaching the gospel. And you see, that's where he got his suffering. He didn't get his suffering because he was stealing the offering. His suffering came because he was preaching the gospel. And let me just say this to you: no matter where you are, no matter what country you're living in, no matter what region you're living in, if you preach the gospel, the preaching of the gospel is going to bring suffering. Now, in some countries, it may mean your death. I remember years ago preaching in the country of Bangladesh. And at that time in Bangladesh, if you made a convert, it was punishable by death under Islamic law. And I remember two young men, as we were getting ready to leave, they got in a canoe, a little dugout canoe, and they rowed that little canoe to a village that hadn't heard the gospel. 3 months later, those two young men gave their lives for the sake of the gospel. I'm looking forward to a great reunion in heaven with those two young men. You see, the preaching of the gospel will always bring suffering. Now, it's not something that we in America that we like to talk about, but you know what? It's something that here in America, it's increasing daily. But I remember preaching the gospel on street corners in Dallas, Texas, and having a man come up to me and said, "If you don't shut up, I'm going to shoot you with my big gun." And it was very obvious that he was carrying a gun. What was it? Was it that he hated me? No, he hated the gospel. He hated God. We talked about that earlier this week. How, as unbelievers, we were hostile towards God. So the Apostle Paul, going back to verse number 24, he says, "I rejoice, I have great joy, I have great gladness. I am so satisfied on the inside of me," a satisfaction that comes from the joy of knowing that I've preached the gospel. And then he goes on, he says, "And in my flesh I do share on the behalf of his body." What did he share in his flesh? He shared stripes from a whip. He shared beatings. He shared being slapped in the face. He shared stonings. He shared in his flesh with Jesus, because that's what Jesus took on the cross. The mockery, the shame, the beatings, the physical torment. The Apostle Paul says, I'm sharing that, and I'm sharing it with his body. He said, if I do my share on the behalf of his body, which is the church. He said, I'm doing this for the church. I'm doing this so that the church can be established. And then he goes on and he says, in filling up what was lacking in Christ's affliction. What does he mean by filling up what was lacking in Christ's affliction? Did not Jesus suffer completely? Yes, he did. But we as believers need to understand that we continue to do things that cause persecution, that cause suffering. We are continuing to fill up Christ's affliction, or Christ's sufferings, Paul is doing what was lacking. He's doing something. He's doing his part in bringing to completion all that Jesus did. You see, when you preach the gospel, you know what you're doing? You're bringing completion into people's lives. You're bringing completion. You're bringing this gospel that's going to make them right before God. And so Paul says, I'm doing everything so that Christ's afflictions, or Christ's sufferings, are made complete. Wow. I hope that you've enjoyed this. God bless you. We're going to talk to you again tomorrow about what Paul has gone through.